What if the opportunities you are waiting for are not absent from your life, but invisible to your current mind? This is an uncomfortable truth because it removes the illusion that life is simply withholding something from you. It suggests that reality may already contain doors you cannot yet perceive, invitations you cannot yet recognize, and possibilities you keep walking past because they do not match the version of yourself you have learned to believe in. Most people think they are stuck because nothing is happening, but often something is happening. Signals are appearing. Conversations are opening. Ideas are arriving. Small coincidences are trying to guide them toward a new path. Yet the mind filters reality through familiarity. It does not show you everything that exists. It shows you what your identity is prepared to accept. And this is where transformation begins. Not with forcing, not with chasing, not with exhausting yourself trying to prove that you deserve more. It begins with realizing that your external world is not only shaped by what is available, but by what you are internally able to recognize as available for you. Because if your mind cannot imagine you receiving more, becoming more, or living differently, it may pass by the very opportunity that could change everything. And the question is, how many doors have already opened while you were still seeing yourself as someone who could not walk through them? Why do some people remain in the same place for years, even when they genuinely want change? At first glance, it seems like a problem of effort. Maybe they are not trying hard enough. Maybe they lack discipline, resources, or the right strategy. But if you look deeper, a more subtle pattern begins to emerge, one that has nothing to do with action and everything to do with identity. Because the real reason people stay stuck is not that they cannot move forward. It is that they cannot truly see themselves living a different life. Pause for a moment and consider this. When you imagine the version of yourself who already has what you desire, more freedom, more recognition, more abundance, does it feel natural, or does it feel distant, almost like you're picturing someone else? That gap is everything. The mind does not move powerfully toward what feels unfamiliar. It hesitates. It questions. It delays. Not because it is broken, but because its primary function is to preserve what feels known, safe, and consistent, even if that safe reality is limiting. So you can want something deeply and still resist it unconsciously. You can take action but hesitate at critical moments. You can get close to change and then retreat without understanding why. Because until your internal image expands, your external results tend to repeat. And here is the deeper question. If your life does not change, is it because nothing is available or because something inside you is not yet ready to accept it? If this perspective is opening your mind, take a moment to subscribe and like the video so you don't miss what comes next. What if the most important decisions shaping your life are not made in the world, but in silence, inside your own mind? There is a place most people never learn to observe, a private, invisible space where every possibility is quietly evaluated before it ever becomes real. A kind of internal theater where future versions of your life are either accepted or rejected. And this process happens so quickly, so automatically, that you rarely notice it. You might think you are open to change. You might even say you are ready for something new. But the moment a different reality presents itself, an unexpected opportunity, a bold idea, a new direction, something subtle occurs. A reaction, a feeling, a quiet voice that either leans in or pulls away. This is the hidden battlefield. Not between you and the world, but between the version of you that wants to expand and the version that is still loyal to what is familiar. Because every future must first pass through your internal filter, and that filter is not logical. It is emotional. It is based on what feels like you. So when a possibility does not match your current identity, your mind does not always say no out loud. Instead, it creates hesitation, doubt, distraction. It delays action just enough for the moment to pass. And then it feels like nothing happened, but something did happen. A future knocked and was quietly turned away. So now the question becomes unavoidable. How many times has your life tried to expand, while something inside you kept choosing the same version of reality? What if everything you've been told about desire is incomplete, and that's exactly why it hasn't been working? You've probably heard it before. Want it badly enough, and it will come. But if that were true, wouldn't the people who desire the most already have the most? Look closely, and you'll notice something almost paradoxical. Some of the strongest desires are paired with the greatest frustration. The more intensely someone wants something, the more distant it can feel, as if desire itself is somehow pushing it away. Why? Because desire, on its own, does not move reality. Desire can beg. Desire can hope. Desire can even suffer. But desire, without alignment, often reinforces the experience of not having. When you want something from a place of absence, your attention is constantly focused on what is missing. And your mind, acting as a precise filtering system, begins to confirm that absence everywhere you look. This is the subtle trap. You think you are moving toward something, but internally, you are rehearsing the feeling of not having it. And reality responds, not to what you say you want, but to what you consistently feel as true. This is why two people can desire the same outcome, yet experience completely different results. One is hoping for it. The other is already relating to it as something real, something natural, something expected. So the real shift is not in how much you want something. It is in whether your mind recognizes it as possible and your identity allows it as part of your reality. Because until it feels real within you, it often remains out of reach outside of you. Have you ever noticed how quickly your mind can dismiss a possibility without you even realizing it? Someone mentions an opportunity. An idea crosses your path. A door appears, even if just for a moment. And instead of curiosity, something subtle happens inside you. A quiet tightening, a hesitation, a thought that sounds almost harmless. That's probably not for me. But what if that moment is not neutral at all? What if that is the exact point where your future is being silently rejected? Because rejection is not always loud. It does not always sound like fear or resistance. Sometimes it disguises itself as logic, as realism, as a calm, reasonable conclusion that keeps your world exactly as it is. And the most powerful part of this process is that it feels true. You don't question it. You don't analyze it. You simply move on, believing that nothing meaningful was lost. But something was. A potential version of your life was evaluated and declined. Not because it was impossible, not because it was unavailable, but because at that moment it did not feel aligned with who you believe you are. This is the mechanism most people never see. They think they are waiting for the right opportunity, when in reality, they are filtering out anything that challenges their current identity. So the deeper question becomes, How many times have you said no without saying it out loud, and how many of those silent rejections have quietly shaped the life you are living now? What if the thoughts you consider harmless are actually the ones shaping your entire reality? Not the dramatic ones, not the obvious fears, but the quiet, repetitive phrases that pass through your mind every day without resistance. Maybe one day. That's not for people like me. I'll try when the time is right. These don't feel like decisions. They feel like passing thoughts. But your mind does not treat them that way. Your subconscious does not evaluate truth. It evaluates repetition. And whatever you repeat, even subtly, becomes instruction. This is where things become dangerous. Not because these thoughts are loud, but because they are consistent. They create a baseline, a silent agreement about what is realistic, what is allowed, and what is out of reach. So while part of you may desire more, another part is constantly reinforcing limits through language that feels normal. And over time, this creates a contradiction. You say you want expansion, but you think in patterns that preserve your current identity. You say you are open to change, but you internally delay it with phrases that keep it safely in the future. And the mind, always seeking coherence, resolves this contradiction in the simplest way possible. It keeps your reality consistent with your most repeated thoughts, not your strongest desires. Not your biggest dreams, your most practiced internal dialogue. So here is the question most people never ask themselves. If your thoughts are instructions, what reality have you been quietly programming without even noticing? What if the real obstacle in your life is not outside you, but the version of yourself you keep returning to? Most people believe they move toward what they want. That desire pulls them forward, guiding their actions and decisions. But if that were true, wouldn't your life already reflect everything you've deeply wanted? Instead, something else is happening. You don't consistently move toward what you want. You move toward what feels like you. This is the identity barrier. It is the invisible line that separates what you can imagine from what you can embody. And anything that exists beyond that line does not feel like an opportunity. It feels like a mismatch. So even when life presents something aligned with your desires, your system evaluates it differently. Not based on whether it is possible, but based on whether it fits your current self-concept. And if it doesn't fit, you hesitate. You question it. You delay. Sometimes you even walk away from it entirely, convincing yourself it wasn't right. But the truth is, it may have been right. It just wasn't familiar. Because identity is not just a belief. It is a pattern of thoughts, emotions, and expectations that your mind has learned to maintain. And your entire system is designed to protect that pattern, even when it limits you. So the deeper realization is this: until your identity expands, your reality tends to recycle. And now the question becomes unavoidable. Are you truly blocked by circumstances or by the version of yourself that still feels safest to be? Why is it that when you try to imagine your ideal life in full detail, your mind suddenly goes quiet? Not relaxed, not peaceful, but blank. It's a strange moment, isn't it? You know what you want in a general sense: more freedom, more clarity, more abundance. But when you try to bring it into focus, to see it clearly, to feel it as something real, something inside you hesitates. That hesitation is not random. It is a signal, because imagination is not just creativity, it is access. It is the bridge between what exists as potential and what becomes possible for you. And when that bridge feels unstable, unclear, or distant, It reveals something deeper than lack of vision. It reveals lack of permission. Your mind is not struggling to create an image. It is struggling to accept one. And the moment it encounters a version of reality that feels too different from your current identity, it does not always reject it directly. Instead, it withdraws. It blurs the image. It removes clarity. It makes the future feel vague, undefined, and just out of reach. So you stay in generalities. You say you want more, but you cannot fully see it. You say you are open, but you cannot feel it. And without clarity, your mind has nothing concrete to move toward, because the brain does not pursue abstractions. It responds to what is specific, emotionally charged, and internally accepted as real. So the real question is not what you want. It is this: why does your mind hesitate to let you see it clearly? Have you ever felt a subtle discomfort the moment you imagine something bigger for your life? Not fear exactly, not doubt in the obvious sense, but a quiet tension, as if something inside you tightened the moment you allowed yourself to think beyond your current reality. That feeling is not random. It is the invisible ceiling. Every person carries an internal threshold, a limit that defines what feels acceptable, achievable, and safe. And this limit is rarely conscious. You don't decide it logically. You feel it. It shows up when you start to imagine more success than you've ever experienced, more visibility than you've ever allowed, more abundance than feels familiar. And instead of excitement, something shifts. Your body contracts. Your thoughts become cautious. Your mind begins to introduce subtle resistance. That might be too much. Or what if it doesn't last? This is not weakness. It is conditioning, because your nervous system is calibrated to what it has known, not to what is possible. So when you step beyond that calibration, even in imagination, your system interprets it as instability. And what does it do? It brings you back to what feels normal, back to what feels predictable, back to what feels like you. This is why so many people unconsciously limit themselves, not because they lack potential, but because expansion feels unfamiliar. So here is the deeper realization. That discomfort you feel when imagining more is not a sign that it's too much. It's a sign that you're touching the exact boundary that has been shaping your life all along. What if your mind is not showing you reality but editing it? Right now, as you move through your day, there are countless signals, ideas, opportunities, and connections unfolding around you. More than you could ever consciously process. So your brain does something essential for survival. It filters. But here's what most people don't realize. Your brain does not filter based on what is true. It filters based on what is familiar. There is a system inside your mind, often called the reticular activating system, that acts like a gatekeeper. Its role is to decide what gets your attention and what gets ignored. And it makes that decision using a simple question. Does this match what you already believe is relevant to you? If the answer is yes, you notice it. If the answer is no, it disappears from your awareness, even if it could change your life. This is why you can walk into the same environment as someone else and see completely different things. You're not perceiving less. You're perceiving differently. Your beliefs, your identity, your expectations, they are not passive. They are actively shaping what becomes visible to you. So when you say, there are no opportunities, what you might really be saying is, my current identity is not recognizing them. And this is where the shift begins. Because the moment you understand that your mind is filtering reality, you stop asking, why isn't anything happening? And you start asking a much more powerful question. What am I currently unable to see because of who I believe I am? How can two people stand in the same city, breathe the same air, face the same economy, and yet live completely different lives? It seems almost unfair at first. One person experiences expansion, opportunities, growth. The other feels blocked, overlooked, stuck in repetition. Same environment, different outcomes. So where's the real difference? It's not just effort. It's not just timing. It's not even just luck. It is perception. Because reality does not present itself equally to everyone. It presents itself according to what each person is prepared to see, interpret, and act upon. One person walks into a room and notices connections, possibilities, openings. Another walks into the same room and notices limitations, competition, and reasons to stay quiet. Both are seeing something real, but they are not seeing the same version of reality. And this is where the deeper mechanism reveals itself. Your perception is not neutral. It is shaped by your identity, your past experiences, and your expectations about what is available to you. So instead of asking, why does life favor some people? A more accurate question would be, what are they seeing that others are not? Because when your perception expands, your behavior changes. When your behavior changes, your results begin to shift. And suddenly, what once looked like luck starts to look like alignment. So the real question is not whether opportunities exist in your environment. It is this: are you perceiving the same reality as the version of you who already lives the life you want? What if the very way you evaluate your future is quietly keeping you exactly where you are? Most people believe they are being rational when they think about what's possible for them. They look at their current situation, their income, their environment, their past results, and use that as a reference point to define what comes next. It feels responsible, grounded, logical. But what if this habit is the very mechanism that limits your expansion? Because when you measure your future using your present conditions, you are not projecting forward. You are recycling. You are taking what already exists and stretching it slightly instead of allowing something fundamentally new to emerge. This is why growth often feels slow, incremental, almost predictable. Not because life only offers small steps, but because your mind only permits what feels like a continuation of what you already know. And anything beyond that, it gets labeled as unrealistic. Too far, too different, too uncertain. So you stay within a narrow range of possibilities, calling it being realistic, while unknowingly reinforcing the same patterns over and over again. But here's the deeper shift. Reality does not expand because you analyze your current limits more accurately. It expands when you stop using them as the foundation for what's possible. Because every breakthrough in your life will require you to think beyond evidence, to imagine beyond proof, to allow a version of reality that your current conditions cannot yet justify. So the real question becomes, are you planning your future or quietly repeating your present? What if the limits you experience are not fixed, but reinforced by a loop you repeat every day? Think about how your mind operates when you imagine your future. You don't just see images, you evaluate them. You decide, often instantly, what feels possible and what feels out of reach. And every time you do that, something subtle happens. You are not just observing your limits, you are strengthening them. Because the moment you think, that's not realistic for me, your mind registers it as a boundary, a rule, a line that should not be crossed. And the more often you repeat that evaluation, the more solid that boundary becomes. This is the programming loop. You imagine, you evaluate, you limit, you repeat. And over time, what started as a thought becomes a pattern. What started as a pattern becomes a belief. And what becomes a belief begins to shape your perception of reality. So now, instead of seeing possibility, you see confirmation of your limits. Instead of exploring new directions, you filter them out automatically. And without realizing it, you are participating in the very process that keeps your life consistent. Not because life is fixed, but because your internal rules are. This is why simply thinking positively rarely creates change. Because if the underlying loop is still active, it will quietly override any temporary shift in mindset. So the deeper question is this: are you trying to change your life, or are you still reinforcing the same internal rules that define what your life is allowed to become? What if the limits you defend today were never truly yours to begin with? Think about the beliefs you carry about money, success, visibility, or what is realistic for someone like you. They often feel personal, as if you arrived at them through experience, logic, and careful observation. But did you? Or were they installed quietly, long before you had the awareness to question them? From early childhood, your mind was absorbing patterns, not just from what was said, but from what was implied. The way people around you reacted to opportunity, the way they spoke about risk, failure, wealth, or recognition, the emotions attached to expansion or to staying small. You didn't analyze these signals. You internalized them, and over time, they became part of your internal operating system. So when you now think, that's too much for me, or people like me don't usually reach that level, it doesn't feel like conditioning. It feels like truth. But here is the deeper reality. Most of your limits are inherited perceptions, not objective facts. They are interpretations of the world that were accepted without conscious choice, and then repeated until they became familiar. And anything familiar begins to feel safe, even when it restricts you. So the real shift is not about forcing yourself to think bigger. It's about recognizing that what feels normal may simply be what was repeated the most. And the question becomes unavoidable. If your current limits were learned, what else might be possible if you stopped treating them as absolute? What if the reason you feel stuck is not a lack of opportunity, but a silent conflict happening inside you? On the surface, it seems simple. You want more. More clarity, more freedom, more expansion. You set intentions, you think about change, you even take steps in that direction. But beneath that conscious desire, another force is at work. A quieter one, a more persistent one. A part of you that is not trying to expand, but to maintain. Because while one part of your mind is reaching forward, another part is holding the blueprint of everything that has ever felt familiar, safe, and predictable. And when these two forces collide, something subtle happens. You don't stop completely. You move, but inconsistently. You begin, but hesitate. You get close, and then something pulls you back. Not because you lack discipline, but because your system is divided. This is the internal conflict most people never see. They interpret it as laziness, as lack of motivation, as confusion. But in reality, it is coherence trying to restore itself. Your mind is designed to keep your identity stable, So when your actions begin to point toward a version of yourself that feels too different, your system introduces resistance, not to harm you, but to protect what it knows. So now you're not just moving forward. You're negotiating with yourself. And until that conflict is resolved, progress will always feel like effort. So the deeper question becomes, are you truly resisting change, or are you trying to expand without bringing your identity with you? What if your mind is not creating reality in the way you think, but tuning into it like a signal? This idea shifts everything. Because instead of imagining reality as something you must force into existence, you begin to see it as something you align with, something you access, not something you chase. Think of your mind like a receiver, constantly scanning for frequencies that match your dominant state. Not just your conscious thoughts, but the deeper patterns, your expectations, your emotional baseline, your sense of identity. And just like a radio, it does not play every station at once. It locks onto one. So if your internal state is shaped by doubt, limitation, or inconsistency, your perception begins to tune into experiences that reflect that frequency. You notice obstacles. You interpret events through uncertainty. You reinforce the same narrative. But the moment your internal signal shifts, something remarkable happens. You don't enter a different world. You begin to perceive a different version of this one. New ideas stand out. New connections make sense. New opportunities feel relevant. Not because they suddenly appeared, but because your mind is now calibrated to recognize them. This is where the concept of co-creation becomes real. You are not just reacting to life. You are constantly tuning into a version of it. So the deeper question is no longer, how do I get what I want? It becomes something far more powerful. What am I currently tuned into, and what would change if I adjusted that signal? If desire alone were enough, wouldn't your life already look exactly the way you've imagined it? So why is there often a gap between what you want and what you experience? Because reality does not organize itself around your wishes. It organizes itself around your frequency. And frequency is not what you say you want. It is what you consistently embody through your thoughts, your emotional patterns, your expectations, and the subtle assumptions you carry about what is possible for you. This is where many people unknowingly create resistance. They desire something intensely, but internally, they feel the absence of it. They think about it from a place of distance. They imagine it as something that might happen someday. And that someday becomes the signal. So while they believe they are moving toward their desire, they are actually reinforcing the experience of not having it. Because the mind and body do not respond to intention alone. They respond to repetition and emotional consistency. What you repeatedly feel as true becomes your baseline. And your baseline determines what feels familiar, what feels available, and what you are naturally drawn to. So when your internal state matches the reality you desire, not perfectly but consistently, something shifts. Your actions become aligned. Your perception becomes clearer. Your decisions become more direct. And what once felt distant begins to feel expected. Not forced, not chased, but recognized. So the real question is not, how badly do you want it? It is this: what are you consistently practicing as your reality, even when no one else can see it yet? What if the change you've been waiting for doesn't begin in your circumstances, but in the way you internally experience reality? Most people try to change their lives from the outside in. They adjust their actions, search for better strategies, wait for the right moment, or hope that something external will finally shift in their favor. But what if that approach is reversed? What if the real turning point happens when your internal state changes first? Because the moment your inner experience shifts, your expectations, your emotional baseline, the way you relate to yourself and to possibility, the same external world begins to reveal something different. Not because it changed overnight, but because you did. This is subtle, but powerful. You start to respond differently in situations that once triggered hesitation. You interpret events through a lens of openness instead of limitation. You take actions that feel natural, not forced. And most importantly, you begin to recognize opportunities that were previously invisible to you. This is not about pretending everything is already perfect. It's about aligning your internal state with the version of reality you are ready to step into. Because once that alignment begins, momentum follows. Not through effort alone, but through coherence. Your thoughts, your emotions, and your actions start pointing in the same direction. And that is when change stops feeling like something you have to push and starts feeling like something you are finally allowing. So the question becomes, what would shift in your life if your internal state stopped waiting for proof and started leading the way? What if your environment is not just influencing your life, but quietly defining what feels possible to you? Think about the spaces you move through every day, the conversations you hear, the expectations that surround you, the level of thinking that feels normal in your circle. You may believe you are making independent choices, but your environment is constantly shaping your perception of reality. It sets the baseline for what feels achievable. It normalizes certain outcomes. And without realizing it, it conditions your nervous system to accept a specific range of possibilities. So if you are surrounded by limitation, even subtle limitation, your mind begins to calibrate to that frequency. Certain ambitions feel excessive. Certain goals feel unrealistic. Certain identities feel out of reach, not because they are impossible, but because they are unfamiliar within your environment. This is why change often feels difficult when you try to grow while staying in the same context that defined your previous limits. Because your surroundings are not neutral. They reinforce patterns. They stabilize identities. They remind you constantly of who you have been. But here's the deeper shift. When you step into a different environment, physically, socially, or even intellectually, your mind begins to update what is normal. You see new standards. You witness different outcomes. You experience possibilities that no longer feel abstract. And slowly, your internal ceiling begins to move. So the real question becomes, are you trying to expand your life while staying inside the environment that taught you to stay the same? Have you ever noticed that there is a specific moment when something that once felt impossible suddenly feels obvious? Not easy, not guaranteed, but no longer distant. That moment is subtle, but it changes everything. Because before it, your mind treats a new reality as something abstract, something other people experience, something you might admire, but not fully relate to. And then something shifts. You see it differently. You understand it differently. You feel it as something that could actually belong to you. This is the moment reality expands. Not because the external world changed overnight, but because your internal relationship to it did. What once felt far away becomes familiar. What once triggered resistance begins to feel natural. And that emotional shift is the key, because your nervous system no longer interprets that reality as a threat or a mismatch. It begins to accept it. And once acceptance begins, resistance dissolves. This is why growth often feels slow until it suddenly accelerates. Because there is a threshold you must cross internally. A point where your identity adjusts just enough to allow a new version of reality to feel safe. And once that happens, your behavior changes almost effortlessly. You move differently. You decide faster. You recognize opportunities without hesitation. And from the outside, it looks like everything changed at once. But the truth is, the shift happened within you first. So the deeper question becomes, what would need to feel familiar for your next level of life to finally feel possible? What if self-sabotage is not a flaw in your character, but a form of intelligence trying to keep you safe? Most people judge themselves when they fall back into old patterns. They call it lack of discipline, lack of focus, lack of willpower. They believe something is wrong with them. But what if nothing is wrong? What if your mind is simply doing exactly what it was designed to do? Protect your sense of identity. Because from the perspective of your nervous system, familiarity equals safety. And anything that moves you too far beyond what you have known, even if it is positive, can feel like a risk. So when you begin to step into a new version of your life, your system evaluates it. Not logically, emotionally. Does this feel like me? Is this stable? Is this safe to maintain? And if the answer is uncertain, your mind does not always stop you directly. Instead, it redirects you. You lose focus. You delay important actions. You return to habits that feel comfortable. And from the outside, it looks like sabotage. But internally, it is regulation. Your system is trying to reduce the gap between who you are becoming and who you have been. This is why force rarely works, because you cannot fight a mechanism that believes it is protecting you. You must update it. You must show your system, gradually and consistently, that this new level is not a threat, that it is stable, that it is yours. So the deeper question becomes, are you trying to eliminate self-sabotage? Or are you ready to understand what it is trying to preserve within you? What if the life you're waiting for is not something you achieve, but something that emerges the moment everything within you points in the same direction? Up until now, you may have been trying to change isolated parts of yourself, your thoughts, without fully shifting your emotions, your actions, without updating your identity, your environment, without aligning your internal state. And when these elements are disconnected, progress feels heavy, inconsistent, temporary, because your system is divided. But alignment changes that completely. Alignment is when your thoughts, your emotional baseline, your identity, and your actions are no longer negotiating with each other. They are reinforcing each other. You think in a way that supports your direction. You feel in a way that sustains your momentum. You act in a way that reflects who you are becoming. And you place yourself in environments that stabilize that version of you. This is when transformation stops being effort-driven and starts becoming natural, because there is no longer internal resistance pulling you back. There is coherence moving you forward. And once this state is established, reality begins to respond differently. Not because it suddenly changed its rules, but because you are finally interacting with it from a unified state. So the final realization is this. The life you experience tomorrow is not determined by what you want today. It is determined by what your mind, your emotions, your identity, and your actions consistently agree is real for you. And the question is, what version of reality are you fully aligned with right now? If this shifted the way you see your reality, take a moment to subscribe and follow the channel. Like the video and share it with someone who is ready to see differently. Because the more people understand this, the more consciously reality begins to change.